Slide 4, the past is tense, the post-secondary ableism crisis. Now, I want everyone to take a minute and go back to March 2020 with me just for a moment. I don't enjoy doing this myself, so I understand some of the resistance or perhaps some of the discomfort that you might have. But I want you to take a moment and think about that time and when we had to make these quick shifts from in-person to versions of online learning for the sake of a global health crisis. So when we think about that, lockdowns that we were all faced with in March 2020 helped foster a newfound appreciation for individuals' constant or recurring social isolation that often occurred for disabled individuals up until this point. So what this means is that a broader range of non-disabled individuals came to understand social isolation from a different perspective. Sometimes they themselves started to realize that the physical space could not accommodate physical distancing requirements. And then they also found out that tech platforms required both technological skill sets and updated technology that may or may not provide easy access to course participation. Now, when we think about those social distancing requirements forcing that triage shift to remote learning, all the preferred options of many privileged non-disabled individuals became more expansive. So these might have included flexible or non-existent attendance policies, alternate means of course discussion, fluid temporal course arrangements that might take place outside of a set standard time. So this would be something like an asynchronous course that didn't have a set time that the class would meet. This, of course, did not mean that there weren't deadlines, certainly, but it just meant that there wasn't a scheduled time that everyone had to meet throughout the week. Now, what's interesting about this is, because of this global health crisis, all of these options became available that were difficult for disabled individuals to attain before the pandemic. So such accommodations were no longer deemed suspect and instead became the empathetic order of the day. That said, these triage shifts created numerous unintentional barriers, especially when courses were converted on a one-to-one scale. That means essentially taking an in-person class and merely just repurposing it for online. And that makes all kinds of assumptions about the individuals not only taking the class, but the individuals that taught the classes as well. In other words, more often than not, what would happen is when we design courses for cyberspace or the physical classroom, it's easy to imagine our audiences as non-disabled, of a certain age, adept with technology, sufficient means to access said technology and supports. Now, of course, campuses, even since March 2020, experimented with these different course modalities nationwide, so things like synchronous online, asynchronous, reduced in-person numbers, hybrid, high flex, and this was all essentially so that we could continue to conduct the business of the university. Now, while it's true that they indeed experimented with these course modalities, that one-to-one conversion tendency, where we would take an in-person course and repurpose it for online, wound up replicating additional barriers in cyberspace. So let's say we're designing a synchronous course, for example. Case in point, WebEx, I'm sure some of you in this room are familiar with. I personally hated it. But WebEx and other similar web conferencing software were rife with usability issues throughout the pandemic. And what this essentially meant is that teachers had to opt for more attractive options like Zoom at their own expense or through free account signups. Both of these raise serious privacy concerns. If you're interested in learning more about these privacy concerns, one of my committee members, Dr. Kat Mahaffey, specializes in this area. And it's pretty serious stuff that we have to think about. But it's also a barrier that emerged during that pandemic when we made these kind of one-to-one shifts. Now, designs of classrooms across the course modalities, whether we're talking about in-person or in cyberspace, says a lot about who is and isn't permitted to use. Who do we want there and who do we not? So although best practices in online writing instruction and online literacy instruction scholarship Here on out, I'll refer to this as OWI, they've warned against these type of barrier pitfalls for more than 20 years before the pandemic even came to pass. But even still, it became clear that pivoting to remote learning risked re-excluding disabled individuals who benefited at least partially from pandemic era flexibility. Essentially, there is a disconnect between best practices and actual implementation during the pandemic that mirrors the gap between idealized campus imagery and the reality of the physical barriers experienced for many students and faculty for that matter. Just as a rapid shift to online learning exposed shortcomings in accessibility, traditional college campus design, often celebrated in popular culture, reveals deeply ingrained assumptions about who does and does not belong in higher education in the first place. So for a moment, I want you to imagine with me, okay? Think about a college campus. What does it look like? Maybe you can imagine a large main entrance with a roundabout and two massive brick gates. You travel down the main road, you pass 5 to 6 four-story academic buildings with massive stone steps leading up to the entrance. Now, I could go on, but I won't for the sake of time. These images are ones that so many of us are familiar with. It's what most films and TV shows present as the ideal picture of university life. Yet the designs, like things like stairs and gates, are hallmarks of exclusion. Not everyone can use stairs. Gates work as mechanisms of keeping people out while protecting those within, and of course vice versa. And frankly, think about the phrasing of my original question. I said, what does a college campus look like? I'm assuming that those within the sound of my voice are cited or have been cited at one time to have seen some iteration of a university campus. In sum, how we design our classrooms, brick and mortar bound or in the bytes and pixels of cyberspace, says a lot about the types of body minds we privilege and the ones that we exclude. Slide 5. Hindsight is 2020, especially in the year 2020. Prior to the pandemic, I'd spent much of my career up until that point designing and researching best practices for course accessibility and online writing instruction. My colleagues and family members can attest to the fact that I have spent an inordinate amount of time designing, revising, tweaking, overhauling my classes year to year to ensure that students can actually learn and be successful. Yet when March 2020 rolled around, all that good practice and scholarship went right out the window. So you can take a look here and see a little bit about my situation as it was in March 2020 when we had to all pivot to remote learning. You can see I had 2 children at home. One was 6 months old, still nursing. I had a rising kindergartner recently diagnosed with autism. That son with autism received 20 hours of in-home therapy. A children's caregiver, that was my mother, was at high risk for complications from COVID and also in daily contact with 2 people, my father, who has an autoimmune disorder, and my grandmother, who was in her 90s at that time, and she's still here, 95 and still going. I also have my own personal mental health concerns, and anybody that knows me sitting in this room knows that I am a clean freak and a germaphobe, which is hilarious considering the fact that I had 2 young children at home in the middle of a pandemic. I also had work responsibilities where faculty in my department depended on me to essentially be a learning management expert, a tech expert, and a support person as well to help them do this online delivery work. I did have my colleague, Dr. Kat Mahaffey, that assisted with this also, but she and I had very different life situations, of course, during that time. So, although I was fortunate enough, even with all of these things going on, I was fortunate enough to be in a department that actually would have allowed me to teach asynchronously online to alleviate these numerous work-home life bleeds that were competing for my attention. But instead, I chose, rather stubbornly, to teach synchronously online. I chose it because I believed it's what my students needed. I chose it because I had a disconnected sense of course modality, access, and disability. I chose it because I had an ableist sense of course modality that believes to teach asynchronously means to be lazy. I chose it because I failed to see the affordances and constraints that each modality individually and comparatively had to offer. And this was even with all of my experience and knowledge in terms of accessibility and OWI/OLI best practices. Now, individual preferences when we're thinking about course modality is undeniably significant. But however, these must be viewed within a larger context of equitable access and the diverse and evolving needs of an institutional body. Every higher education campus is different. It has a different set of student and faculty and staff populations. In other words, what I'm asking for in my dissertation, or what I'm looking at in my dissertation, is that we need to challenge our assumptions about course modalities, such as synchronicity is ideal because it captures that busyness of the classroom and work in a traditional time frame, versus this notion of asynchronicity allowing a person to simply let the course run and sit around all day, every day, doing whatever they please, binge watching the latest show on Netflix, let's say. Now, I'm being hyperbolic, of course, but these kind of assumptions that seem rather extreme, where someone, that teaches asynchronously sits around and doesn't do much except for maybe plays a video game or watches a show or whatever it may be, those opinions actually do exist and do persist throughout various iterations of education scholarship. Now, the long-established rhetorics and information design principles of OWI/OLI, they know this conversation well. They know that sort of misperception about what different course modalities in the online sphere can offer. Essentially, we know that multiple modality options benefit students and faculty, even outside of times of crisis like the pandemic. But when we think about these multiple modality options, they benefit everyone, but especially those with disabilities, and not always necessarily in the ways that we might expect. Slide 6, Opportunity and the Difficulty, Gaps and Exigencies. Now, OWI/OLI scholarship has consistently focused on accessibility barriers throughout the last 20 years, including things like socioeconomic status, age, technological skill sets, available technologies, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, etc. That said, in 2015, human-centered design expert and OWI scholar Dr. Sushil K. Oswald notes that many seminal works in OWI/OLI quote, have overlooked disability in their discussions even when they are considering questions of access, end quote. Instead, access from a disability perspective is often buried under other attending concerns and can, at times, appear compulsory. Now, I want to be clear, this is not to say that the work of OWI/OLI is wrong, but rather there is a gap of opportunity where marginalized voices of disabled individuals have an opportunity to affect a fundamental change to the higher educational landscape, one that is ultimately more inclusive for everyone. Now, I think we're at a particularly decisive moment, almost 5 years after the crash course and the course crashes of March 2020. To underscore the particular exigency to this project, please refer to Figure 1 on your handout titled The Rhetorical Situation Addressing Ableism in Higher Education. This diagram essentially helps to put into perspective the various reasons for more focused attentiveness on access, accessibility, and disability that's listed on this slide under Bullet 2. What my proposed dissertation offers to the existing OWI/OLI rhetorics of course modalities is a replicable collective access model for assessing the affordances and constraints of course delivery modes. So things like in-person, synchronous, asynchronous, hybrid, high flex. Generally speaking, collective access is a collaborative, co-constructive, ever-evolving accessibility effort in which non-disabled designers and users and disabled designers and users come together to create a shared understanding and application of access. Now, I agree that informal conversations about access, say in a classroom setting, they're essential, and it provides innovative ideas to develop accessible courses. I've seen it happen even in my own experience as a teacher. But that said, we likewise need models to gauge access concerns more formally, and this is something that my dissertation offers. In other words, we have to determine models of course modality needs that are sustainable and attentive to the diverse needs of an institutional population at a given point in time. This helps us make more informed decisions about how to distribute labor, how to have different offerings and support, etc., for both faculty and students that ultimately becomes a more inclusive classroom environment. Slide 7, tetrad versus pentad. Now, up until this point, we've briefly covered what is the post-secondary ableism crisis, so there is a challenge that we need to address. We've also looked at my own personal investment in this project, and of course, from the perspective of scholarship in OWI-OLI, we've talked about a potential gap of opportunity and the exigency for this dissertation project. Now we got to talk about how are we going to create a collective access framework that institutions can use to make informed decisions about course modality offerings. That's where this tetrad versus pentad model comes into play. Now, this tetrad model is actually something developed by communication studies scholars Marshall McLuhan and his co-author Powers. So McLuhan and Powers actually proposed a framework for seeing technology for its affordances and constraints, while also at the same time considering that particular technology's history and its future possibilities. Now, what this does is they offer a series of questions to help us understand what that particular technology enhances, obsolesces, retrieves, and then eventually can develop into when the technology is pushed to its extreme. Now, conspicuously absent from this series of questions is the issue of mitigating factors that can seriously impact an artifact's positive or negative outcomes, or at times reverse them. Okay? So again, the tetrad model allows us to consider those affordances and constraints across time. So what does the technology enhance? What does it erode, retrieve, and reverse? So let's think of it this way. How might, if we're talking about a mitigating factor, how might each writer's disability status affect these aspects when using a cloud computing platform like Google Docs? Okay. So Google Docs and other composing platforms and devices have been pushed to their limits, ostensibly, to develop disability-conscious options because disabled individuals depend on assistive technologies in order to engage effectively. However, as many scholars point out, this is often at a late stage in the design process when significant time and money have already been spent. So put another way, what does this artifact, the technology, Google Docs, mitigate? Figure 2 on your handout illustrates what this revised pentad framework would look like. So we started with the tetrad, which was McLuhan and Powers. I've added an additional question about mitigating factors, which creates a pentad. So in looking at that illustration, let's think about Google Docs as our example and go through each aspect of these questions. So firstly, Google Docs enlarges time, meaning that anyone collaborating on the document can work in different temporal rhythms, okay? Co-constructing knowledge and co-authoring, sometimes that's difficult outside of, different working practices and times, and as such, ideas can sometimes get lost. However, because we have version histories in Google Docs, this obsolesces the need for multiple files or drafts because that complex history of thinking and development is retained in the cloud space. And this can certainly enhance metacognition. And from a teaching perspective, you can always go back in and see who wrote what at a particular time, which can be useful for lots of different reasons. In terms of retrieval, Google Docs does mirror what was called a correspondence mode of learning. So the correspondence courses where individuals would write into, let's say, a newspaper ad to learn something about a particular topic. So individuals here engage in knowledge making by communicating with others in a doc that's not necessarily bound by the linear conventions of time. When it's pushed to its extremes, Google Docs needs to provide pathways, other pathways for collaborative composition, such as some writers need to be able to talk out their thoughts instead of sitting there and staring at a blank computer screen, which definitely happened to me several times in the last 2 weeks as I prepared for this presentation. Similarly, other co-writers may need to hear the written word of someone else in order to figure out how their thinking challenges, extends, or aligns with their colleagues. Of course, this reversal in the technology is an example of disability conscious design positively impacting everyone, since principles of speech to text and text to speech are predicated on assistive technology like screen readers. And since Google Docs has both of these accessible features, we might automatically assume that the mitigating factors of the artifact, the technology, has already been addressed. They aren't. And here is where the collective access model using this PenTAD is so important. For example, it was only through collaboration, an informal collaboration with a disabled colleague, that I learned that Google Docs did not, in fact, mitigate his disability-related barriers, because Google Docs notoriously does not work well with screen reader technology. So while on the one hand, a person with a learning preference for hearing the written word, like my son Liam, for example, thrives in a Google Doc space, whereas someone with a visual disability requiring a screen reader can unintentionally get excluded. And I want to clarify, my son Liam is my older son that is autistic, and so hearing stuff is really beneficial for him, and so this accessibility option in Google Docs works for him. A visually impaired colleague that uses a screen reader does not. Slide 8, methods and study design. So for my dissertation project, I'm actually proposing a mixed methods research study with human subjects. There will be IRB approval at my own home institution of UNC Charlotte, and obviously Clemson University as well. And in this mixed methods study, I will be asking students and faculty to consider the affordances and constraints of each course modality, but rather than just polling them about their preferences and what they think about these modalities, I'll be using the PenTAD framework that I adapted from McLuhan and Power's tetrad model that we discussed on the previous slide. My guiding research questions for this project include research question 1, what are each course delivery mode's most significant affordances and constraints? And research question 2, what are the key factors influencing the affordances and constraints that stakeholders feel they have across these various class modalities? So arguably, OWI-OLI is the primary scholarship informing my research questions because of its sustained attentiveness to modality. However, I would also argue that a triangulation of OWI-OLI, disability rhetorics, and collective access is needed to give a level of nuance that otherwise wouldn't be possible. Put another way, my choice follows OLI Principle 4, where I'm proposing a framework for assessing an individual institution's course modality needs by applying expertise across the disciplinary boundaries of my 3 research areas. You can refer to your handout for a link to OLI Principle 4 so that you can read it in its entirety. I didn't want to take up space on my slides with this, and there's a lot of good information and examples there that would benefit for folks to read on their own time. Now, those are my 2 research questions. So what is the study design? It's essentially a 3-phase process. So I will conduct 2 focus groups, one comprised of faculty and the other of students, in the Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies, WORDS, department here at UNC Charlotte, where I'm currently employed. So participation in the study will require one 10-minute intake survey that allows participants to disclose or not disclose their disability status and share their comfort level discussing issues of disability, access, and accessibility in course design. So that's an intake survey to gauge comfort level, but also give them an opportunity to disclose or not disclose disability status, which I know might sound a little discomforting to some, but there is a rationale for it, which I will talk about shortly. Next step in the process is one 30-minute norming session, where we'll discuss expectations and boundaries for discussing issues of disability access and accessibility to ensure that individuals feel safe and supported as we discuss these particularly sensitive issues. The final step in the process is one 1.5-hour focus group involving a discussion on the affordances and constraints of the course modalities using that PEN-TAD model. Now, I agree that asking questions about disability status is a risk that may make some of my participants feel uncomfortable, whether they're disabled or not. I make this move with the intake survey trailing the footsteps of scholars in my 3 areas. For instance, Sushil Oswal's 2015 call to bring disability to the center of course design and delivery discussions in OWI-OLI. Knowing the said disability status helps account for otherwise obscured, marginalized voices. In terms of disability rhetorics, Margaret Price's work in 2024 with disabled academics models rapport building between the principal investigator, myself, and the participants by allowing to share their disability status and personal comfort level, discussing issues of access and inclusivity. By them discussing this with me individually, it allows them to start to build a rapport to where they know that we're doing this kind of work to hopefully improve issues of access and inclusivity in the classroom. Now, of course, in terms of their disability status being revealed to the other study participants, that is not going to be the case. Identifiers and such will be stripped out of the equation, and if people choose to self-disclose of their own volition during the actual focus group, that of course is their choice, but that is not something that I would disclose as the principal investigator leading this study. 3, from Collective Access Scholarship, Mia Mingus in 2010 calls to action for non-disabled and disabled individuals to come together to create and apply access, meaning that this study has to have a mix of disabled and non-disabled participants. That's one of the main reasons why I'm also asking about disability status, because I want to ensure fair representation. Obviously, given these particular best practices and recommendations from the scholarship that's come before my own work. I also recognize that engaging in such conversations about disability, access, and accessibility inevitably can make participants feel vulnerable and at times perhaps threatened, which is why I chose to include this norming session, setting boundaries and expectations for our discussions. Precisely because our participants can come to this project with such differing perspectives and life experiences means that I need to give space for participants to share their concerns and suggestions before proceeding. This also models the kind of research approach that Margaret Price talks about in her 2024 work, which I highly recommend you taking a look at if you get some time. Such an approach follows what disability rhetoric scholars point to as involving disabled stakeholders in the process for developing the study, rather than merely using them as objects of study. Slide 9, data collection and analysis. The focus groups that we'll conduct in that 3rd stage are going to be audio recorded and then later transcribed using Adobe Premiere Pro. Now, I selected this program in particular because Premiere Pro has a pretty good track record of being able to accurately transcribe an audio recording, despite accents. For example, my own accent, Adobe Premiere Pro does a pretty good job of being able to catch even my funnily pronounced words from time to time. Once these particular transcripts are complete, I will follow a series of steps, of course, to protect the data. So for one, we'll strip any identifiers to protect participant identities. I will also destroy the audio recordings of the focus groups. I'll then use in vivo to code the data according to phrases and words generated from a pilot study that I completed in 2023, and I'll talk about that a little bit more a little later in the presentation. But some of those words and phrases include things like flexibility, work-life balance, instructor labor, cognitive load, burnout, community, accessibility, instructor presence, needs, and of course frustrations. Once I've coded the data with in vivo, I will then collate said coded data according to each modality. So according to asynchronous affordances and constraints, synchronous affordances and constraints, in-person, hybrid, high flex, all of those in terms of affordances and constraints. And you'll have an opportunity to look at some of that pilot data to get a better sense of what that might look like as I proceed with this larger scale version of the project. Slide 10, Spotlight on the Focus Groups. On your handout, you can refer to the operationalized terms of each of the course modalities. So that would be asynchronous, synchronous, in-person, etc., as well as other terms like access, accessibility, and disability. I want to note that the course modality definitions are paraphrased from the 2021 OWI State of the Art report, which is grounded in solid online pedagogy. The terms access, accessibility, and disability, however, are based on a triangulation of how each of my research areas, so OWI, OLI, disability rhetorics, and collective access, deploy these terms in the scholarship. Now on your handout, please take a look at figures 3 through 5 to demonstrate this triangulation of their use of these terms if you're interested in learning more about that. And you can see that it isn't just a matter of showing how each discipline uses these terms differently. It's a matter of showing the level of meaning and the way that they look at issues of disability, access, and accessibility. So it adds a level of nuance that otherwise wouldn't be possible and helps us understand a more rich way of looking at these particular terms. Now, you'll also see here under bullet 2, there's a pin-tab list of the questions below. I started out with what does an in-person synchronous, asynchronous, blended, high flex course afford you or allow you to do on an individual level, and then from there I proceeded with the bracketed ellipses to indicate those same things. Now, I grant you that these questions from the revised pin-tab model, they're complicated. And perhaps it might seem simpler to just merely poll students and faculty about their course modality preferences. And we certainly could, and there have been times that I've done that on an informal basis myself as a researcher and a teacher. But as I discussed earlier with my own misguided example back in 2020, had I actually taken the time to have a conversation with someone else about my preferences, their perspective may well have corrected my thinking at the time. I know for a fact that my colleague, Dr. Kat Mahaffey, would have given me, shall we say, a pretty stern talking to about my flawed logic. Personal examples aside, posing questions in this manner as a discussion with a group of disabled and non-disabled individuals is collective access in action. Rather than just asking about preferences, the questions are framed such that individuals can think about the possibilities and perhaps think beyond themselves, using personal experience as a point of reference for larger discussion. Now, this sounds lovely in the abstract, I grant you, but the question, of course, is, does it really work? Well, let's take a look at my pilot study data from fall 2023 to get a sense of how this played out initially and what sorts of revisions I made as a result of conducting that pilot study. Slide 11. Does it work? Yes. All right, as we talk about some of the trends and patterns that I noticed in my pilot study data, I'll ask you to refer to the pilot study hyperlinks on your handouts for the complete study data if you'd like to learn more about that project. There's access to coded transcripts for each of the different modalities and their affordances and constraints. And just looking at the coded transcripts alone is an interesting read, partly because students in particular were highly aware of access needs in ways that I was, thoroughly surprised. And they had some really interesting discussions and ideas. It was so interesting to watch these students even talk about issues of ambient conditions in a class, like crosstalk in online spaces, and how these can be challenging for people with specific disabilities. Now, I do have to say that the individuals that participated in this did not disclose disability status, and for all intents and purposes appeared to be non-disabled. Faculty discussions about access were equally interesting, while also focusing on the sheer volume of work and potential burnout for trying to account for all of these accessibility options at once. I personally understand this inclination very well. When I know something needs to be fixed, I want to do it now, I want to do it all, and I want to do it perfect. There are folks sitting in this room that would probably attest to that fact very emphatically. Perfectionism at its finest. I have a slight problem. That said, this pilot study did help me slow down and realize that such access is ongoing, ever evolving, and that's encouraging. That makes it a little less onerous when I think about the sheer volume of work and time that this kind of research and praxis takes. However, the collective access piece of this original pilot failed in one pretty glaring way. I had no idea if the participants I was working with were a mixture of disabled and non-disabled individuals, which of course risked excluding some of the marginalized voices that can fundamentally change the landscape of higher education. So as you can see on this slide, there is just some quick highlights to kind of give you a sense of what was learned as a part of the pilot study. So faculty and students recognize the advantages and disadvantages across all of the modalities. It was also interesting to see that people that otherwise, especially from the student perspective, would have preferred in-person classes, talked a lot about the affordances of asynchronicity as a particular course option. Both of the groups also emphasized accessibility and technological infrastructure. You have to have that sort of technological support where the faculty member does not have to become tech support for the class, which is sometimes hard to do within an institutional setting. Student engagement, of course, is a key factor as well. There was a heightened awareness of diverse student needs and barriers. Pedagogical best practices and institutional support were highlighted as a must, even from both student and faculty perspectives. Students did note a stark difference between courses where faculty obviously had experience teaching online prior to the pandemic versus ones that learned to do it just at the beginning, kind of in process. This pandemic-induced shift to online learning revealed both challenges and opportunities for us to reimagine course modalities and ultimately what post-secondary education can look like in the future. Slide 12. So if we know that highlighting disability is an advantage to help us think about the affordances and constraints of course modality more generally, then the question of course becomes, why didn't I take this approach with my pilot research? Why haven't others? Part of this answer, and indeed I would argue the severity of the crisis of ableism that we now find ourselves in post-secondary education, is that talking about disability is difficult precisely because the rhetorics of disability are steeped in a long tradition of fear, pity, and disgust. Disability as a point of research is also difficult because space-time can and does work differently for disabled individuals. Margaret Price demonstrates this by discussing how her work took 10 years to complete, which is often not respected in higher education productivity guidelines. Her work also demonstrates, quite practically and empathetically, that access on a university campus is a matter of mutual responsibility and commitment. Engaging in this type of co-construction and cooperation of access benefits everyone, including the ever-present bottom line. Let's consider for a moment those enrollment cliffs that those of us in higher education have been hearing about for probably 10 or more years. 2025, the year we now find ourselves in, is projected as the peak enrollment of 18-year-olds that will continue to decline over the next 15 years, with estimated 2041 numbers showing a drop of 13% of traditional college-age students. A potential solution to said enrollment drops is to lean into more flexible models of post-secondary education, which can be informed by disabled students and faculty. This may help us see other opportunities for knowledge making that aren't necessarily predicated on matriculation. We can imagine things where it's not about getting a degree, but taking a class, a certification, any number of things could be possibilities that emerge from highlighting disability in this type of research when we think about long-term viability of institutions of higher education. Slide 13. Given the current landscape of higher education, which is still emerging from the lessons learned during the pandemic, now is the ideal time to revisit course modalities through the lens of historical development and its current state and future potential. These conversations, much like research, are not finite. Collective access is an ever-evolving, fluid, and mutual responsibility because disability is a natural part of human diversity, and the non-disabled are, in fact, only temporarily abled. Such perceptual shifts do what Mia Mingus writes as, quote, moving the work of access out of the realm of only logistics and into the realm of relationships and understanding disabled people as humans and not burdens, end quote. And perhaps most importantly, the privileging of disabled voices in the discussion of affordances and constraints with course modality can result in a more dynamic and an adaptable learning environment that can meet the needs, preferences, and material conditions of an institution and its people. It is a future imperfect, for certain, but it's also a future of opportunity, one that might well come to better include my son Liam, for whom access and connection is a daily struggle. Thank you very much for being here today and listening to my proposed dissertation research. I look forward to your questions and ideas to help me continue to improve this project. Thank you very much for listening.